too, because you've got so many interesting parts of your life. Obviously, we've heard you're the author of the House of Youssef, which is a great book of short stories, and you've now written this book, Australiana. You're a science teacher at a high school, locally, and you've got a really interesting background with your university degree, and it's not an English degree in literature, etc. It's in science, and I wondered, could you tell us a little bit about that, because that's a fascinating part.
So my English teacher is actually here, who taught me year 10, 11 and 12, Miss Geraldine Parker. I'd like to point her, she's right there.
You'll be proofreading later.
And there are many things that I did learn at school, many books that we actually studied that still are with me today. But it was definitely a very conscious choice not to study literature at uni. Mainly because I didn't want to be told how to think and interpret the books that I love, and also with my writing I didn't want to be told how to actually write. So yeah, it was definitely a conscious choice, and I do think that the science does affect the way that I write, that it does tend to be a very precise way of writing. Yeah.
And do you think there's an influence sort of with, scientists, structure, climate change, all of the different things that sciences bring? Do you feel that influences your writing as well, as a general feeling?
Not particularly, but I do think that scientists tend to be very specific with their words. I don't think they tend to be highly opinionated with things. I think it tends to be very factual, and maybe that does influence the writing, maybe in terms of a worldview more than anything.
So you're really a slashy. You're a teacher, you're an author. Is it the goal to be a full-time author, or do you love the combining of what you do?
No, I don't feel the need to actually do the writing full-time. I think it's good to be out in the world, and I really do enjoy teaching. I find it quite rewarding on good days and quite traumatic on bad days.
I'm not sure whether your former teacher wants to comment.
Very traumatic on bad days, but I think it's good to actually have that. And students, I teach high school, they're teenagers. I think they have a lot of stars in their eyes, which I think is quite nice.
If you're going to have stars in your eyes, it's important as a teenager, rather than that's the only time you're probably going to have it. So
yeah, I think
you want to keep them in there.
They tend to go out when you're an adult, so yeah, it's nice to teach teenagers.
Yeah. Look, Australiana is set in a small Australian town. We'll talk about Tamworth later. And I felt that there seemed to be hundreds of stories that were oozing from this town. And I thought, it's a typical small town. Everybody seems to know everyone else's business. Or do they? There were times when I thought maybe not. And I felt it was very much that Australian regional life, gently, a bit under a microscope, but also revealing the heartbreaking elements too. And I wondered whether you might want to set the scene for us with a reading from the chapter, The Break-In, and we'll get the mood right up from the word go. Go for it.
Right, so The Break-In is actually the very first one in the book, and if you do have a silver spoon, you're about to find out why you have a silver spoon. So the town, and so The Break-In. This is getting to be a joke. He's not yet been in this house a month, and he's been broken into 4 times. The first time, he closed his eyes and prayed they wouldn't come upstairs. He could hear them chatting downstairs, having a laugh, discussing which of his possessions was worth the most. They pushed and shoved, something broke on the floor, and he lay in bed praying, not even believing in the God he was asking to protect him. They cleared out, taking only his grandmother's silver spoon. He told everyone about the spoon, but people said he was lucky to get off so light. That had been the first time. The second time, he had been in the yard raking leaves. He was making a racket. It should have been a deterrent, but it wasn't. And they lifted the fly screen from its frame and climbed through the window. He yelled out as they were walking across the living room. They smiled then and waved, and he went after them, brandishing his rake. He would have thrown it, except he'd break his shiny new things. The third time, he had been on the toilet. He was pulling at the toilet roll when he heard a floorboard creak downstairs. He closed his eyes, more praying and shaking his fist. Was his house the choice for the month? Did this sort meet and exchange tips about the best place for a break and enter? When he told his manager he had been broken into 3 times, once per week, she had sniffed. For it to be classified as a break and enter, they have to actually break something. How would she like it if people went wandering through her house when she was in bed, in the yard, on the loo? How would she like it if they stole her grandmother's silver spoon? And now this 4th time. A joke? Really? His ex said, that's what you get for having the flashiest place in town. Break-in number 4 and he was sitting down to tea. It was the same lot and they strolled in and said hello. Nice place you got here. I would appreciate having my tea in peace if you wouldn't mind. What are you having? And like that, they sat themselves down as if they'd been invited around, and it was normal they should put out cups, draw out his chairs and pour themselves some tea. They also ate his biscuits before saying goodbye to him. As they left, he couldn't help thinking this wasn't the last of them and that he should have made an effort to chase them away.
Thank you. When I read that, I read it again and again, 3 times, because it really moved me for what I've mentioned before, that heartbreaking element, but the indignity of it. And I just wondered, was that I don't want to say inspired because it's sort of almost the wrong word, but was that from a particular incident, or how did that story come about? Just
I was not broken into 4 times. I can say that. That did not happen to me. No, I think it was one about something that is very everyday, and I think also in a smaller town, it's a lot more noticeable who is very well off and who's not so well off. And I do think that was definitely playing on my mind, but it was also a very sort of humorous story that, you know, that these thieves come in and all they take is a silver spoon. Like, it is quite lucky that that's all they took. So yeah, I just thought it as quite a funny little story.
There is that level of humour, but it's also an invasion of one of the sufferings that people have in your stories.
Yeah, but I think, you know, most people at some point have had something stolen from them. I think it's quite commonplace. It's not very nice if it's obviously a home. But yeah, I think there's sort of like a lot of background everyday events that, you know, most people go through that happen throughout the story. I don't think they're particularly specific to this particular town or any town actually.
But highlighting something that's an everyday event, but that meant quite a lot to this particular gentleman broken in.
Yeah, so I think what interests me as a writer are the sort of everyday events that might have a very big meaning for the individual. They don't really resonate. They don't, you know, turn up on the 6 o'clock news or anything. But for that particular person, that's a pretty major event. But, you know, the boss says, well, it's not a big deal, you know. Yeah.
Yeah, and I just wondered with that, I mean, there certainly is a thread in these stories of quite a lot of injustices and sufferings. This robbery, the mugging, name calling. I'm just wondering, is that I'm feeling that is a big interest of yours, to remind people of these, or to show the profound impact that these small events have, these small sufferings. Is that where you're sort of trying to push the reader?
Yeah, I think it's definitely in the first book, in the House of Youssef, and it's definitely in Australiana. I think that sometimes the things that are very important to us are not very necessarily big world events. They're things that happen very personally. They're quite small, and they can actually impact our lives in a sort of massive way. And one of the things that really sort of bugged me in the sort of 3 Tamworth years was that often I'd come back to the city, the area was going through this very, very serious drought, and there was not really that awareness of how serious this drought was and how much it actually affects the community. And so a lot of the stories in this book were about trying to capture what was actually happening in a regional community. Yeah, you know, 25% I think of Australians actually live in regional areas, and I don't know if those stories are necessarily appearing so much in the literary world.
Well, let's go there. This is set in Tamworth, and you've dedicated it to the Tamworth crew. Give us a bit of background of that.
So I moved to Tamworth in May 2018. I'd been to the town a few times. Australiana is set in a fictional town, but it obviously draws on the landscape in and around the area. And, I did work at a school there. There were quite a few characters amongst the staff and the students. I've got some very memorable students from those times. I'm never going to forget them. But yeah, no, it's definitely a very interesting community. It's a very interconnected community, and it really reminded me actually of the town that my parents come from in Lebanon, which is also very interconnected. So in some ways it was a bit of a homecoming, yeah.
And the Tamworth crew? Is that there specific people who sort of held their arms out and gave you the sort of metaphorical hug?
Yeah, I think there is a stereotype about country people being friendlier compared to city people, and I think that's actually true. I think the community was very, very welcoming, and I think from my arrival there, I'd often get suggestions about various road trips and various things that I could get up to on the weekends and stuff. So yeah, it was a lot of fun, and I've got great memories of my Tamworth time.
And hopefully golden guitar somewhere in there.
Yes, okay, so obviously for those who don't know, Tamworth is really known for the Country Music Festival. It's being held in April this year. If you're a bit free, head up the road, check out a bit of country music. So yeah, I think
it's such an influence.
Yeah.
Now, the title of the book, Australiana, a novel. Tell us why.
When I was writing the book, there is a section in the book called My Face is Nameless, and there are a lot of very nameless characters. Often I'll name an animal, but I won't name the humans, because I sometimes feel that particular areas that we're not familiar with are very nameless to us. And so that was sort of the working title for most of the time I was writing these stories, but I didn't think that it was it sort of connected all the various parts of the book. And so Australiana is actually a reference to a book by an American writer, Don DeLillo, who called his book Americana, and it was his first book, and he said that he called it that because he intended to use all of the US as his canvas as a writer. And so it's a sort of a bit of a statement of artistic intent that I intend to write about everything within Australia. So that's why I call it Australiana.
I think it's very apt. Now one thing we should also mention, it's got this fantastic cover, which we just hold it up there. Early on, in the very beginning it says, when the river runs dry, the town runs red. And I paused at the end of that sentence and I looked at that and I thought, wow, that's just set the atmosphere. Where did that line come from?
Yeah, I often, lines do occur to me. There were a lot of drives around the town, and I find driving is actually very good for the stories. But there were also things that people would actually say to me, or I'd overhear, and they were very sort of vivid lines, and a lot of the stories are based on very vivid lines. But that one just popped into my head, and I was just thinking that really when the waters run quite low, and Tamworth for most of the time that I was there was on level 4 restrictions, or maybe even level 5 restrictions, which meant essentially each person is only meant to be using 100 litres of water a day, which is not much at all. So once the water kind of runs out, or it runs very low, it starts to affect the community in pretty massive ways that, potentially the town runs red. Yeah.
Yes, and we certainly detect that in some of the stories. I love the characters. You mentioned a little bit the characters that you've met at your school and school students, and also that they are nameless. But some of them are like Nan and her couch. Great story. I'm not going to do spoiler alert. It's fantastic on that. Michaela, the non-famous brother of the famous bushranger. I just wondered, are you drawing on specific people with these? Because the thumbnail sketches are, I can picture them. I feel like I could just reach out and shake my hand with them.
No, not really, but there were some very memorable characters, and that's like a very ambiguous way to put it. And I did have the sense that the first week I was at school, I did wonder if I'd made a very big mistake. But yeah, no, there are some very dramatic characters. But I think the thing with Thunderbolt, the bushranger, who has a whole section in there, I did think about him being dwarfed by Ned Kelly, that maybe Ned Kelly is like this super famous person and then Thunderbolt is like this lesser bushranger. So I did wonder about this rivalry between these two bushrangers.
And did that particular story, because that is sort of that's the last chapter in it, had that been sort of dwelling and like marinating as a story for you? Because it felt like there were leads that were coming in from all sorts of areas.
Yeah, so I think Thunderbolt does have a pretty big presence in the New England area. There are a lot of references to him. The town of Uralla, which is about an hour north of Tamworth, so it's about 6 hours of Sydney, does have a museum. There's a statue, there's his grave, there's a cave just north of the town, there's his rock where he used to hide out. So he's a pretty big presence, and also a lot of the people in Tamworth do have stories about their great-great-grandparents having encounters with this bushranger. So he's not just this character, he's a real person, and yeah, this real presence in the area.
That filters sort of through this big myth that's all part of it. The setting, obviously, you know, we see it's Tamworth, but there are other surrounding areas, and Barabba, that's how you pronounce it? Barraba, sorry, yeah. Barraba. That was of interest too. Tell us a bit about why that gets included.
Yeah, I think saying a lot of the names of places up there, I think they are deliberately there to confuse people. There's one where it's called like Gunnagunnu Road, and it's actually both words are written exactly the same. So I think just to throw people so you know the locals from the people who are not locals.
Yes. But
yeah, Barraba is a town also an hour north on a different road from Tamworth, and as I've mentioned, it was a time of drought, and a lot of people were sort of thinking about how do we attract people to our town. A lot of livestock was actually being sold off, and these three women in the community just decided, well, they've got one of those silos that has not been used for a very, very long time, and they essentially fundraised a lot of money. I think it was almost about $100,000 for various things to actually get that silo painted, so that people would detour to Barraba to actually check out the town, hopefully stay in the town. And I think a lot of towns have obviously done this, and it does bring a bit of life to towns, especially in times that are quite desperate. Because
certainly there's, in the stories, you get the feeling of things get done when the locals decide it has to happen. Yeah, it's a pain actually trying to do anything in a city, trying to talk to people, going to go see someone in the council. Well, I think in a small area, it's very easy to meet the people who are actually involved in a project and really get things done in a very, very quick way. Yes. It quite shocked me actually how quickly these three women, they just made this decision and that's it. They went and raised the money and they painted it. While I think if I wanted to paint some building or some site in Parramatta, imagine the DA.
It would never happen. It would never happen. Yeah.
There are a couple of characters though, one in particular I'm thinking, who takes measures into her own hands and gets stuff done very quickly. Perhaps it'll be a bit illegal, but I'll let everybody get to that story.
Which one is that?
It's Marina.
Marina, the young one?
It's the lady with the weapon, can I say?
Yeah. She's,
she gets things done.
She's a very desperate woman,
She is, indeed. And she certainly takes a lot of the action into her hands. Let's talk about, what leaps out at you when you read this is this quintet structure. You've got the town, My Face is Nameless, The Blind Side, Pilliga, and Captain Thunderbolt. And then each chapter has got these short bursts of stories. It's a structure that keeps you reading. It's a structure though that does allow you to sort of go, that was pretty hard hitting. I'll just make a quick cup of tea and then I'll come back to it. Why that structure? Why did you want that? I mean, I think it works brilliantly, but talk us through how that happened.
Yes, so I think there's two schools of thought when it comes to writing. There's the first school who plot and they plan and they come up with things and then they go and write it. And then there are others who it's quite free form. I'm the second group. There's not much plotting and there's not much planning. It wasn't sort of a conscious decision, but I think if you're telling the story of a community, it's quite hard to get all the layers and the nuance if you're just doing a straight novel structure with chapters. I think the structure itself has to be quite flexible to give the sort of various viewpoints their space. So I think it kind of works well with this, but it wasn't deliberately plotted or anything like that.
It's an ecosystem though, isn't it?
It's an ecosystem. So the publisher has said it's a novel, guys. It's not a novel. It's actually an ecosystem.
Cross that out.
Just ignore that. That was a mistake. No, I say it's an ecosystem because in science we the way we teach it to students is that an ecosystem, there are science teachers here, is an area and you take into account the living and the non-living factors. So the living could be the humans, it could be the plants, it could be the animals, and then the non-living are, water, temperature, pH, and a few other things. And it's sort of the interplay between the two of them.
But there's also the feeling of if something goes out of balance, there are consequences.
Yeah, and that's the whole, the study of ecosystems is looking at sort of this equilibrium or this balance within the whole structure. And I think Australiana is actually an ecosystem, not so much a novel. But if we put that on the book, it's obviously going to confuse people. So it's a novel.
Look, you could market it then as a science textbook maybe as well. Look, can we just pause now? And I want to invite you to do another reading because this also sets the mood in this novel. Now this is The Kangaroo. Take it away.
So, The Kangaroo. David hits the kangaroo just before dawn. He thinks, my nan will kill me. He thinks, I can't slow down. He thinks, I have killed an icon. He thinks, that must be Paul. The kangaroo hits the front and then flies off the top of the car. David slows down enough to hear the body thud on the road. It is not yet dawn. Light is a fraction off. He is shaking as he reverses, triple checking for other cars. That would top it, to have an accident straight after hitting a kangaroo. He pulls over, leaves the engine running. He feels stupid approaching Paul, who's probably dead anyway. What will they say when they find that Paul has been killed, struck by a motorist as he crossed the road? He realises it is cold. He left his jacket at home. A jacket, a blanket, would have been useful. He could have propped it under Paul's ear, made him comfortable as he died. He could go back to the car to check for a towel, even a cloth would do. He remembers he has one thick sock on the back seat, its other half long gone. Why does he have half a pair of socks? Why did he make no effort to find its partner? Why didn't he bin the useless sock? He had hoped its partner would turn up. That must be it. Paul is convulsing on the asphalt. His eyes are dreamy, glazed. They stare, they are unfocused. David trembles looking at him. He dares not touch him. He may very well bite. A dying animal is most dangerous at dawn and dusk, his nan once said. Teeth, claws, the whip of a tail. He has watched a documentary about animal fights. It comes to him now. Being punched by a kangaroo is equivalent to being slammed with a brick. What is he doing here? He shivers at the breeze. There is a finger of light at the horizon. The black is a fraction less black. A rooster crows. A crow edges in with his friends. They can afford to wait. They have nowhere else to go, thinks David. Is he waiting? Is he waiting for Paul to die? Paul closes his eyes. They flutter. His arm twitches. His foot kicks. David feels the most useless he's ever been in his life. He dares not come any closer, not when he can smell death in the air. Paul sucks in a breath and then goes still. He waits a full minute. It is 5:22 a.m., Tuesday the 4th of March. He grabs Paul by the tail and drags him to the side as gently as he can. What does gentle mean on the roughness of the road, the fur of one's face pressed to the ground? He imagines the skin tearing and forces himself to stop, thinking about it and simply do it. He leaves Paul on the side. In tears, he goes to his car and drives back home. He showers, pulls on warm clothes and shuts his eyes as Paul did not that long ago. He falls asleep wondering how it would have felt for Paul to die.
And again, you've got that dark humour in an everyday situation. I mean, it's horrible to think that, but it's true that you're on a country road, and even any of us who've done any country driving, that feeling of, oh, have I hit a kangaroo? Am I about to hit a kangaroo? Was that something that was a talking point, I guess, as a everyday thing when you're in Tamworth? Or hit another roo, or?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of animals on the road, and people generally are quite conscious that if you are driving in the sort of dark hours, that there is a very, the chances of actually hitting an animal are quite high. And, people obviously, protect their cars, but there are a lot of dead animals on the side of the road. And I find it very interesting that, these are our sort of national icons. And I found it very interesting to name a kangaroo, to give him a name, yes, when obviously, a lot of the animals are nameless, and it does really change something if you begin to name it.
Yeah, well, you feel partly responsible. You feel you want to know, could you have done something better? You actually think, if I ever do that, maybe that kangaroo has another life and a name, and you go deeper into it than just, look, I think I just got to,
get rid of the animal.
Get rid of it.
Yeah, no, I think that there's a, this idea of things being nameless. I think the minute you start to give things their proper names and to actually use them, it completely changes things. And often they say that road rage, the reason that we, can have these episodes of road rage is because the other motorist or the other driver is completely, we don't know them, we can't see them. And I think we do treat a lot of things in our surroundings in that way.
And again, also the small sufferings coming through, yet again another thread that, I found very prevalent. Now, very few of us in the audience, except for Libby, are authors or writers, although there might be more.
There's
actually.
a few.
Sorry.
There's a few.
Well, maybe this question's almost redundant for me then. I just wondered, I always think, wow, the task of writing a book is quite overwhelming. Maybe the other writers want to put it behind and say, yeah, it is. Can you talk us through your writing process?
Yeah, so mine has evolved a little bit. It's pretty relaxed. So I usually go out for coffee in the morning. I try and write for 15 minutes a day in the morning, and then that way it's done. So I think most of these stories are quite short because they were written over coffee. And for me to write a novel, I'm going to need the bottomless cup that goes for about a year. So I think it's generally, I tend to write when I'm out, and then I hand write my stories, and then later on type up and edit.
Because I often sort of think that to write a short story, and it can be writing anything for those of us who aren't authors but we write in our work, sometimes you think, I needed more time to make it shorter. Mm-hmm. That brevity is really hard, and you've nailed these stories, and I'm just wondering, maybe it is coffee fueled and that's it, but it is an incredible structure that there's not a wasted word. And I wondered, was that an aim? You sort of thinking, I really want to make this so tight and precise because it's like a cliff at the end of it. That's it.
Yeah, well, obviously there are people who plot and plan their lives, and they have, great plans, and off they go, but I'm not someone like that. I think that usually I have an idea as to what I'd like to do with a story. I usually have the first line, and I just write it as it is. And if it's 4 lines, there is a story in the book that is only 4 lines. I just go with that structure, and I don't feel the need to expand it into 3 or 4 pages or into 100 pages. I think sometimes the story just needs to have the structure it has.
Speaking of the 4 lines, that'd be speed dating.
Speed dating.
Do you think we can do another? That is cracking.
Yeah.
I know, I've actually written down page 185.
Oh, you've got it.
I've got it.
Good, thank you.
Because I found that
speed
perfect.
dating. This one's going to be short, guys. You might miss it.
4 lines.
So, speed dating. She was at the wheel, and she was determined he'd be impressed. She sped up. He egged her on. She flipped the car, and they smashed into a tree. She did not impress him, and now no one else will. It's not funny.
But that's the thing. It's this black humour that pervades these moments where you feel utterly heartbroken, but you're laughing and you're thinking, gosh, I shouldn't do that. But I think, you know, like good theatre, when that does, the message comes home to you far more because of your emotions being in this zone where you can't quite account for why you're feeling two different things at the same time. Have we got still a little bit more time before questions, Libby? Or yeah, great. Look, I'm going to ask the boring cliche one because I want to know. But books that changed your life or led you onto the path you're at? And if you say Pride and Prejudice, we just discount that. I want a new one.
It's not Pride and Prejudice. So, I read recently this interview with this children's author, and she was saying that within the literary structure that children's writing is sometimes dismissed because it's for kids, but often the books that really change us tend to be children's books. So anyway, when I was 16, I read this book, Young Adult Horror or something like that, and it was about this young novelist who's in high school and he's super successful, no one knows who he is. And I actually decided to start writing after I read this. The book is called Master of Murder by Christopher Pike. No one's ever heard of it. But that actually has had the biggest impact on my life. So
have you written to Christopher about this?
I did actually get in touch with him. It's a pseudonym, and I just did say, you know, thank you, because it set me on the path. Yeah.
Did you get a reply?
Yeah, he did. He was actually very, very lovely. He's sort of like not as popular as he was in the 90s, but he was very, very lovely about it, actually.
He's destined then for a reboot for all this. Do you think then, I mean, I know that students tend to Google their teachers and find out what they're up to. Tell me, have you had any experiences with your students sort of going, yes?
Yeah, the minute they know their teachers' names, they all know their teachers' names these days, they instantly Google them. And the school that I currently teach at, it was the first day, and the student next day comes up to me and goes, "Oh, Miss, you're also a writer." I'm like, okay, you know, that's a bit forward. But I did also have this incident when I was in Tamworth and I was teaching a science lesson, and a student began to recite something, and I was thinking, you know, that sounds very familiar. And he was actually reciting one of the Thunderbolt poems that he'd found online. So anyway, yeah, they're generally pretty funny about it, but I find it very weird that they instantly Google their teachers.
Look, it's probably actually a little bit of a tribute too. I mean, and also it means that if there are any budding writers at your school, do you find you might be a little bit of an inspiration to them?
I don't know about inspiration, but I think if I know that students are, you know, they have other creative pursuits or they have other interests, whether it's dance, writing, movies, whatever, I always try and encourage them, because I think there usually is quite a few people who say, you know, be sensible, don't worry about this. So I always try and encourage them.
I think that's terrific being a teacher to do. One other story that caught my eye too that I do want you to read, but I found it quite odd sitting there, was the one called A Fairy Tale. Judging from your reaction, maybe it is meant to be odd. Can you tell us how that fits into the rest of the Australiana? Because to me it sort of was suddenly not quite Australiana, but maybe it was.
So the fairy tale is about a guy who's trying to, I think he wants to marry this woman, and to do so,
a typical prince and princess.
It's a very prince and princess. But anyway, her dad basically says, you know, you need to go to this tree and you need to collect these leaves because she needs, I don't know, a wreath or something. He's like, okay. And so he sets off, and you know, he can hear like these wild animals. It's a very, very big property. He can see former lovers of this girl who've perished on the way to collect the leaves, and he pretty much grabs them. It's a bit of a dark ending, but I really like the idea of calling something a fairy tale, and then it's not really a fairy tale.
Because again, there was that darkness in it.
Yes.
But that makes you go deeper into it. So it's
a bit misleading, because you guys are expecting a fairy tale and then it's not a fairy tale.
Look, by that point, I was not going to be misled, because I thought these stories are, you know, there's quite a punch to them, and I don't know whether you intended that, but you know, if you're reading it in your bed and you sort of think, oh, there's not, it'll keep you awake. Not as a horror thing, but just as your eyes sort of go up and think, oh, I need to think a bit more about that, and I'm thinking that was your intention.
Yeah, it is deliberate, and I do really like to name things that are a bit misleading. Yeah,
catching us off guard.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And I think then it's a bit more high impact.
Yes, and making
Watch out for it.
little minds as you go in it. The other one that also I think we should mention is the one called Mob Justice.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about that. That's also the high impact.
Yeah, so I think Mob Justice is about a bunch of animals that usually hang out around this water body, and then the humans fence it off, and they no longer have access to their water, and so they essentially take over the town in a sort of funny way. But there was a trip that I did to Lightning Ridge when, the water was quite short and the kangaroos were literally on the main street. And I think there are these sort of instances where, if the animals cannot find what it is that they usually need, they start to actually move into town. And I just find it very interesting that maybe one day they will get back at us for what we've done to them.
Yeah, it was quite frightening, but quite real as well. I actually thought, geez, I better be nice to any wombats or anything that I come across. The time, in terms of the time taken to write this, well, tell us a little bit about that.
Yes, I probably started it the first week that I was in Tamworth, which is towards the end of May 2018, and I think most of them were finished by October 2019. And so, it took a while obviously to edit, but I'd say about a year and a half that first period that I was in Tamworth and, doing a lot of the road trips is probably when a lot of these stories were actually written.
And how do you feel it's sort of developed you've developed from the House of Youssef? Do you see the journey that's gone on, or?
No, not really. No. I think I think even if I think to my writing 20 years ago, I don't think it's really changed that much. It's changed a little bit. Maybe the possibilities in terms of what I can do as a writer have expanded a little. But I think both books are about communities, just in different settings, and maybe the structure's a little bit different.
Well, I feel when you read it, you want to know what happens next to a few characters. So I'm just wondering, is there Australiana 2?
No, it's done.
No?
It's done. This is it. And I generally have this sense there are some characters, even in the House of Youssef and even in this one, where I think it would be nice to come back to them, but generally if they've left the building, they've left the building, so I can't bring them back.
Well, maybe I'll have a glass of wine and see if she can be persuaded otherwise. Look, I thought perhaps at this point, can I open up to any questions? Does anybody have anything for Yumna? About the writing style, or yeah?
It sounds like, I don't know if you like to be included in a genre, and you might hate this as a teacher, but it sounds like climate fiction. Have you been told that before?
I've been told many things, including, I think it has definitely come up. I generally don't intend to, write about very topical things, but the drought and the impact of the drought, and so many towns running out of water, and having the dam levels so low, it's pretty hard to avoid that if you're actually living it. So I think it's really a matter of just recording what was actually happening. But considering what's been happening with the weather and the rain, I suppose it could be very topical. It wasn't my intention, but it was just about drawing on what was happening in the area.
Anybody else?
Come on.
There's one part of it called Pilliga. Is that right? Is that
Pilliga? Yeah, that's right.
And that sort of starts a little differently from others. Do you want to tell us a little bit about Pilliga as part of the quintet?
The quintet, the ecosystem. Yeah, so Pilliga is probably a ghost story, I think. And so one of my colleagues, we were having a chat one night, and he said, you don't go into the Pilliga at night, which to me is a very dramatic sentence, because you immediately want to know where is the Pilliga, and why don't you go into the Pilliga at night. And so they started to tell me all these stories that really felt like urban legends, and there is this story about this woman who used to walk on the side of the road with her trolley, and she used to hitch a ride with quite a few of the trucks. She may have been struck by a truck in the 90s, and they called her the Pilliga Princess, and she makes a bit of an appearance in the book. But it actually really started with that line you know, you don't go into the pillar gut at night. Yeah.
Did you find that was something that country people did a lot, sort of sentences that was like warnings, was that?
I think they're really good storytellers.
Yeah.
They're very, very good storytellers. And yeah, there are a lot of, you know, lines which I thought were very vivid and very, very dramatic.
Were they lines you'd written in a little book, by the way?
Yeah, they did. Yeah, they're definitely written. They're written down, or they sometimes be the start of a story.
Because they certainly set the mood.
Yes.
And you mentioned before your background from Lebanon. Was that a very storytelling childhood as well?
Yeah, I think the family can tell better stories than me, verbally. I think they're very fantastic storytellers, and I think there is a big tradition in terms of with fables and fairy tales and just, you know, little anecdotes. Yeah, I think they're better storytellers.
I think you've done a pretty good job. I don't think you should sell yourself short. I think your families, you know, might find that they're got to run for their money with this. So, anyone else with? Yes.
Have you had readers back from Tamworth, like friends in Tamworth that were there when you were sort of gathering all these tales?
They've gotten a book they've started reading, and I think the judge of success is going to be whether they give it the tick. If they give it the tick, I've done well. If they give it the X, I'm ruined, actually.
If they break off all correspondence.
That's it, yeah. If there's no book after this, you guys know what happened. Yeah.
Yeah, because that is something, isn't it? When you've written about a town and maybe people sort of are either baited with, and whether they're trying to, you know, look for incidents that happened, or, you know, people with failings. There's quite a few people with failings in this, and whether they try and think,
particularly when you're an outsider to the town, and there are people who have grown up in the place. It's an interesting test of how you see them versus
how they
see themselves.
Yeah, I think it's good to be outside of something to actually write about it. There are a few, I've named a few characters after people I know, and I've told them about it. I've tried to make them nice people. But we'll wait and see. Hopefully there'll be good feedback.
Yes, well, a lot of the people who have a bit of problems are nameless.
Yeah.
So that's
they're not the people I know.
Yeah, the good people have got a name, so.
And the kangaroos.
Yes, and the kangaroos, that's right. Anybody? Yes.
Yes, I was just going to ask you whether there was any prospect of another one coming. Have you started work on something else yet?
Yeah, so when Ultimo Press took on Australiana, they also took on The Lovers. Do not be deceived, it's not a light-hearted, happy romantic story.
There'll be a dark side.
Yeah, hopefully next year The Lovers, and that is a bit more of a sort of straight narrative. So hopefully
it's
next
been
year.
written yet, or are you?
It's done. They've got it.
Oh.
Yeah. So
is there another one coming after that?
Of course. You know, there's quite a bit happening.
And you do it in these 15-minute blocks before. Wow, that's a discipline, yeah.
That's everything in life happens in 15-minute blocks.
15 minutes of fame, she's extended to different
writing blocks. Yeah.
And is it a particular coffee? I mean, you know, I'm just sort of thinking if I got onto that sort of, you know, is it a latte?
Give it a go. It's
cappuccino, mocha.
It's the cappuccino, and you're set. Yeah.
There's not a storyboard up on the wall. It's just, wow.
That's right. And I think generally, if there's things I don't want to share, they just sit in a drawer.
Hi. So you were talking about how your writing hasn't changed, and we were wondering, you wrote this story in 2008 for our beautiful friend here, Kimberly. Do you think it has developed since 2008 that Miss Kimberly climbed a mountain and illustrated one?
So illustrate.
I mean, she climbed the mountain and became a serial killer and became 008, so you do still have that dark side to you.
I love those books. These are going to surface. No, I don't think it's actually really changed that much. I think I've always used very simple stories, but I'd like to look at this book.
Yes, it's a beautiful story you wrote about.
Is that called fairy tale too?
That might have a lot of value, so
Just hold on to
get it signed afterwards. Now, are there any other questions? Do you have any questions for the audience? How about something different like that? There you go. Read my book.
I never thought of asking.
I know, I just suddenly turned the table nuts. probably kind of weird, but anyway. But there's a lot of weirdness in this book too, so it's entirely appropriate. Good weirdness, mind you.
It's quirky.
It is. It's very much, and very much now that I know your science background as well, I feel that ecosystem even more. And perhaps on a rereading, I will feel more the web that you've created.
Yeah, I think I think the stories are quite basic, and there's a lot of room for interpretation.
But when you say basic, I don't think people. Yes, you're right in that they're short, but they really go down into some depths that I found quite profound in a fairly short space of time. And I think you sell yourself a bit too short to say they're basic, because whilst they're everyday events, they have such an incredible impact on the people that happen to them, life-changing.
Yeah, I think I really like fables, and I think there's a lot of them are fables. I think structurally a fable is quite a simple story. It doesn't have too much detail, but obviously there's then a lot of room for interpretation.
And there's
so
lessons.
I mean it in that way.
There are lessons usually to learn from the fables. Are you wanting us to have any particular lessons from this? I mean,
not really, no.
I felt when I read this, I thought it made me think, gosh, is there anything I've done today or
To the animals?
Well, a little bit, but just in terms of thinking, is there a little unkindness that I've accidentally done? It just reminded me of the hurts and sufferings people feel. I mean, obviously we're in a time where we have the horrible war in Ukraine, and that is huge, and some people sort of say, oh, well, that's happening, but I'm suffering, and my suffering is so small. But we all know that anybody's suffering, no matter how small, is still their suffering, and I felt that you really picked that up, and I wasn't sure whether that had been something you'd seen in students, in your childhood, in other workplaces, that the profound sadness that those small sufferings can have, and that a careless word or an inadvertent something or a stupid comment can have on someone. And that's...
Yeah, I think in the West we really believe in being, supreme individualists, which is good in some ways, but I think at the end of the day we, all live in communities, we live with other people, and there is a real interconnectedness. And I think what interests me, it's in the first book, it's in the second one, will keep coming up, is this sort of relationship and the relationships between people, and how these very, very small events really may have a very big impact on people's lives. That is definitely very important to me.
And then how the community can gather round and make that better.
Yes.
Not always, but sometimes.
Yes. Just the interconnection.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you, Yumna. I think... Oh, we've got it. Oh, yes, absolutely.
Just wondering if your Lebanese background had any influence on your writing.
Yeah, I think so. The town is structured around the 1001 Nights, so where one story ends, the next one picks up, or there's sort of a symbol that's carried across. I think that the Arabs do have a very good or a very strong oral storytelling tradition, and also a written tradition. Like, it's been there for a very long time, and I think there isn't so much an obsession with the novel as a form. I think there are a lot of short stories, a lot of fables, a lot of fairy tales, and these things I really love. So I think that's probably the biggest influence. Yeah.
Well, look, I just want to say thank you, Yumna. Thank you. Congratulations on a fantastic book and a great title. It's wonderful. It is gripping, it is dark, it will keep you riveted, and it might, like me, make you pause and think, am I always acting, in the right way? Not that I think I've got any really dark problems, but it just makes you think, and that's terrific. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.